Lyra's fingers hovered inches from the jagged, fresh lines marring his chest, the heat radiating from his skin, bridging the gap before she even made contact. Kian Ross didn't flinch, though the neural resonance flared between them, a sudden spike of white-hot awareness that wasn't pain, but something far more dangerous. He was sitting on the edge of the biobed, stripped to the waist, the regeneration mesh humming softly as it knit the last of the damage, but his eyes were locked on hers. They were brown, unprotected, and devastatingly human. "You're loud today," Kian murmured, his voice rough with exhaustion, his gaze dropping to her lips. "And you are still bleeding," Empress Lyra whispered, finally pressing her chromatic palm against the scar over his heart. The contact was electric. A jolt of pure sensation raced up her arm and exploded in her mind, not just his physical ache, but his fierce, terrified relief that she was standing there. Pain wasn't just a sensation. It became their shared language. She could feel the steady thrum of his pulse syncing with her own, a biological rhythm that defied every law of her species. She leaned in, drawn by a gravity she couldn't name, until her forehead rested against his. In that space between breaths, the galaxy with its politics and wars ceased to exist. There was only the heat of his skin, the salt on his skin, and the terrifying certainty that she would burn worlds to keep this fragile, stubborn human alive. But 48 hours ago, he had been nothing more than a curiosity in a uniform. The crystal courts of Vila had been a spectacle of light and diplomacy, a place where violence was a theoretical concept discussed in hushed tones. The bioluminescent trees swayed in the artificial breeze, casting soft, shifting patterns over the gathered delegates. Lyra had been distracted, her attention on the trade negotiations, while her daughter, Princess Miri, played near the fountain, laughing at the shimmering water. It was a scene of perfect, fragile order. The Obsidian Syndicate changed that in a heartbeat. The air didn't shimmer, it tore. Space warped as the assassins materialized, sleek and deadly, bypassing the sensor grids with terrifying ease. They moved faster than Valerian eyes could track, silver blurs aimed solely at the small child freezing near the water's edge. The royal guards were too slow, their reflexes honed for ceremony, not slaughter. But Kian moved. He didn't bring a weapon. He brought a shield of flesh and bone. He collided with the lead assassin, not with grace, but with the brutal, kinetic force of a freight train. The first blade caught him in the shoulder, a spray of red misting the white stone. He didn't stop. He placed himself directly over Miri, anchoring his boots to the ground like roots of an ancient oak. The second blade took him in the ribs, the third in the thigh. Lyra screamed, the sound tearing from her throat, but the human didn't fall. He grunted, a guttural sound of human endurance that vibrated through the floor. Every strike was meant to kill, yet he absorbed them, turning his body into a fortress. As the sixth blade carved into him, something snapped in the air, not a bone, but a barrier. A shock wave of agony ripped through the courtyard. But it didn't stay with Kian. It slammed into Lyra. She fell to her knees, gasping, her mind suddenly flooded with the raw, metallic taste of his blood and the blinding singular directive burning in his neural pathways. Not the kid. Not today. It was the beginning of the memory bleed, a violent fusion of their consciousnesses birthed in trauma. He collapsed only when the threat was neutralized, his blood pooling on the pristine floor, proving to a stunned galaxy that resilience screams louder than violence. "Get him to the stasis unit," Lyra had commanded, her voice cutting through the panic, her own body echoing with phantom wounds. She hadn't realized then that saving him would require more than medicine. It would require a diplomatic shift that would shatter the foundations of her empire. The biobed's monitor spiked, a jagged green line mirroring the sudden surge of adrenaline flooding the room. The moment of intimacy fractured as a high-priority alert flashed across the wall, bathing Kian's scars in urgent red light. "They aren't stopping," Kian said, his voice dropping into a combat register. He didn't need to look at the screen. Through the neural resonance, he felt the cold, creeping dread tightening Lyra's chest. The Obsidian Syndicate wasn't retreating. They were positioning stealth cruisers on the Vylar border, waiting for the Empire to blink. Lyra straightened, the Empress masking the woman. "My council demands a kinetic response. They want to launch the Grand Fleet. If we do, we play into the Syndicate's hands. We cannot win a war in the dark." Kian slid off the bed, wincing as the regeneration mesh adjusted to his movement. He grabbed his shirt, fingers moving with stiff determination. "Then turn on the lights," he said. "Humans don't fight shadows with shadows. We burn them away." He stepped closer to her, the heat of his presence grounding her frantic thoughts. "Radical transparency. Give me access to the deep space arrays, every sensor log, every thermal signature from the attack, every drop of blood spilled in that courtyard. We don't encrypt it. We broadcast it, raw, unfiltered." "It has never been done," Lyra countered, though her mind was already racing, calculating the risk. "To expose our sensor data is to expose our vulnerabilities. To hide is to die," Kian replied, his brown eyes locking onto hers. "Trust me." The command center was a hive of panicked activity, but it fell still when they entered. They moved as a single entity, a terrifying example of symbiotic leadership. Lyra took the central dais, her hands flying across the holographic interface, while Kian stood at her right hand, his instincts guiding her strategy. "Linking neural architecture," Lyra announced. The connection slammed into place. It wasn't soft this time. It was a deluge of data and intent. Lyra felt Kian's tactical mind overlaying her own. A sharp, aggressive clarity that cut through Vylarian caution. He pointed to sectors of the void that looked empty to her, but felt wrong to him. There, Kian gritted out, the pain synchronization spiking as the mental exertion taxed his wounded body. They're masking their heat signatures. Push the gain on the comms buoys. Now, Lyra didn't hesitate. She poured the full power of the grid into the coordinates he visualized. The feedback was immediate and physical, a migraine splitting both their skulls, but they pushed through the agony together. The broadcast went live. It wasn't a polished diplomatic statement. It was a data dump of catastrophic proportions. The galaxy watched the unedited footage of the assassination attempt. They saw the Syndicate's stealth ships stripped of their camouflage, their coordinates blinking in naked neon for every independent system to see. The narrative shifted instantly. The Syndicate was no longer a phantom menace. They were cowards caught standing over a child with a knife. They expected a war of fleets, but lost to a war of truth, Lyra whispered, watching the holographic map turn from red to neutral. The Obsidian Syndicate didn't dissolve in an explosion. They evaporated under the scrutiny. Asymmetrical warfare had turned their secrecy into a noose. Diplomatic channels lit up not with threats, but with inquiries. Alliances fractured. The Syndicate's backers withdrew, terrified of being caught in the light Kian and Lyra had unleashed. Hours later, the command center was quiet. The immediate threat had broken, and the diplomatic shift was palpable. Humanity was no longer seen as just labor or infantry. They were the architects of a new, terrifyingly honest era. Lyra turned to Kian. He was leaning heavily against the console, his face pale but his eyes bright with triumph. The bond between them settled into a low, steady hum, no longer an intrusion, but a permanent anchor. "You risked everything," she said, the distance between them closing again. "Calculated risk," Kian smiled, though the fatigue in his voice betrayed him. He reached out, his hand finding hers. The contact didn't shock them this time. It just felt right. "The galaxy is watching," Lyra warned, though she didn't pull away. "Let them watch," Kian replied, squeezing her hand. "We have nothing left to hide."